My name is Evelyn Hartwell. I'm 64 years old. I used to believe that age would bring a kind of protection, that the older you got, the less capable people were of wounding you. That night proved how wrong I was. It was Sunday dinner at my son Michael's house, the kind of warm Charleston evening where the air smelled faintly of salt and jasmine. The table was set beautifully as Brittany liked it. Linen napkins folded like swans, candles flickering in gold holders. Everything curated for perfection. I brought my lemon pound cake still warm from my kitchen. We were halfway through the roast chicken when Brittany leaned forward, her smile tight and shining. "You're a loser, Mom." The sound fell between the clink of plates and the whir of the ceiling fan. For a heartbeat, no one moved. My fork hung midair, a piece of chicken trembling on the edge. Brittany didn't flinch. She dabbed her mouth delicately with her napkin eyes bright with something close to triumph. Michael didn't look at me. He just kept cutting his food, the knife scraping slow against the plate. My daughter Anna sat stiffly beside him, her lips parted in disbelief. Across the table, my grandchildren stared at their mashed potatoes, as if the right answer might be hiding there. "I'm sorry," I said. My voice didn't shake. Brittany laughed softly, a sound meant to sting. "Oh, come on, Evelyn. It's just a joke. You take things so seriously. We're just saying you should relax more, stop clinging to the past." Her words smelled as sweet and false as her perfume. I looked at my son. He finally met my eyes just for a moment, then looked away. That was worse than the insult. Silence from the child you raised cuts deeper than any stranger's cruelty. The candle beside me flickered. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, and the moment stretched until the air felt heavy enough to break. I folded my napkin, placed it neatly beside my plate, and said, "Dinner was lovely, thank you." Brittany smiled, thinking she'd won something. "Of course, Mom. It's so important to keep family close." Anna started to speak, but I stopped her with a small shake of my head. There was no point. The rest of the meal passed in fragments, talk of renovations, schools, golf tournaments, words floating like ash after a fire. I barely tasted a thing. When Brittany served dessert, I refused politely and rose from my chair. Outside, the night had turned cool, the air humming with cicadas. I walked down the porch steps alone, my shoes clicking against the wood. Behind me, laughter started again, thin, strained, desperate for normalcy. I unlocked my car and sat for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel. My reflection in the windshield looked calm, but something inside had shifted. By the time I drove home, I wasn't hurt anymore. I was done pretending. And before the next sunrise, I would decide exactly where to start taking my life back. The house was quiet when I came home, the kind of quiet that hums in your bones. I kicked off my shoes by the door and left the lights off. The moonlight slipped through the lace curtains, tracing silver patterns across the living room floor. Somewhere above the ceiling, fan creaked as it spun a slow, rhythmic whisper that filled the space between thoughts. I sat on the edge of the couch, still dressed from dinner, the taste of rosemary and humiliation heavy on my tongue. My hands rested in my lap, perfectly still. For years, I'd believed that silence could protect you, that if you stayed calm long enough, people would remember who you were. But that night, I learned silence only teaches others how to forget you. When I finally made it to bed, the sheets felt too clean, too cold. I stared up at the fan and listened to it turn. Each slow rotation seemed to rewind time. Brittany's voice replayed itself in fragments. "You're a loser, Mom. You should stop clinging to the past." Then Michael's silence, sharp as glass. The space between them had been where I used to belong. I closed my eyes and saw the younger version of myself, 32, standing behind the counter of Lawson's grocery, ringing up customers with a tired smile. My wedding ring was still on then, though my husband had already started sleeping elsewhere. I remembered the first night I worked a double shift just to keep the lights on. Michael was sick with the flu, and I'd left him sleeping on the couch with a bucket beside him. When I came home near midnight, he'd woken and left me a crayon drawing taped to the fridge. "You're the best, Mom." That drawing stayed there for years long after the colors faded. I'd thought love, once given, didn't evaporate, it just changed shape. Now, lying in the dark, I realized how naive that was. My eyes moved over the shadows on the ceiling. The fan's blades cut them into slow-moving pieces, turning them round and round like thoughts that refused to settle. I thought about all the things I'd done for Michael, the tuition payments, the car insurance, the down payment on his first home. Every time I told myself it was what mothers did. You give, they grow, and someday they thank you. But that someday never came. I turned onto my side, pulling the quilt up to my chin. The clock on the nightstand read 2:17 a.m. My body felt old, but my mind refused to rest. Somewhere inside, something was shifting. Something small, deliberate, unstoppable. I wasn't angry, not yet. Just empty. The fan clicked again, its steady rhythm marking the hours I'd lost to a lifetime of keeping the peace. Outside the city slept waves brushing against the harbor a few streets away. I wondered how many mothers were lying awake like me, tracing every sacrifice back to where it started. When dawn finally slipped through the blinds, pale and thin, I hadn't slept at all. I swung my legs out of bed, pressed my feet to the wooden floor, and listened to the quiet house breathe around me. The air felt lighter than it had the night before. Something in me had cracked open not from pain, but from recognition. By morning, the air smelled faintly of salt and sunlight. I made coffee strong enough to wake a ghost, then walked into the small study at the back of the house. The room still held the scent of cedar polish and old paper, the kind that clings to memories long after they've gone stale. The mahogany desk sat where it always had, beneath the window that faced the garden. Dust shimmered in the slanted light. I ran my hand along the edge of the desk, tracing the grooves my late husband once carved by accident with his cufflinks. He'd left more scratches than memories. I pulled open the bottom drawer. It stuck as if resisting me. Inside, rows of manila folders leaned together, fat with years of statements and receipts. Each label was written in the neat block letters I'd used back when I still worked as an accountant: mortgage, car loan, tuition, legal fees, miscellaneous support. I carried the first folder to the desk and opened it. Inside were photocopies of checks, bank transfers, and contracts. Michael's first apartment lease, co-signed by me. The insurance renewal for his Camry. The property tax payments for the Sycamore Street house, every one of them drafted from my own account. The paper was brittle around the edges, but the ink remained steady. My name always next to his. Page after page, the same pattern repeated, him receiving, me paying. I used to tell myself it was temporary, that he'd pay me back once he got back on his feet. The trouble was, his feet had never stayed under him for long. I flipped through the folder until I reached a recent bank statement. There, highlighted in yellow, was a transfer from my retirement fund. $20,000. I remembered that week clearly. He'd called crying about a business opportunity, something Brittany's friend had convinced him to join. He said it was safe, guaranteed returns. I'd wired the money before I could talk myself out of it. The return never came. Neither did an apology. I leaned back in the chair and let the papers fan out across the desk. The window light caught the corners, and for a strange moment they looked like a sea of tiny, fragile sails, each one carrying a version of me that had believed love meant rescue. The coffee had gone cold. I picked up one of the checks, touched my signature, and whispered, "So this is what motherhood cost." The sound of my own voice startled me. It wasn't bitter, just tired. Like someone finally reading the ending of a book she'd pretended not to know all along. I gathered the papers into a neat pile and slid them back into the drawer. Then I locked it for the first time in years. The morning light had shifted by the time I turned away from the desk. Outside, the garden shimmered with dew, every blade of grass bright and separate. For the first time, I noticed how quiet it was without the hum of someone else's needs filling the air. I finished the last sip of coffee now, bitter and cold, and set the cup down. There was a strange calm in my chest, one that didn't feel like peace yet, but something close to it. Something that sounded a lot like the beginning of change. The photograph was tucked inside a folder labeled Auto Purchase, 2019. It slipped out when I lifted the papers landing face up on the desk. Michael stood beside the silver Camry, his hand resting on the hood like he'd just conquered the world. The dealership lot shimmered behind him under the June sun, and he was grinning so wide I could almost hear the laugh that came after. I remembered holding up my phone that day saying, "Smile, honey. You'll want to remember this moment." I'd meant it as a promise that this time things would finally turn around. 3 weeks earlier, he had lost his third job in a year. Sales again. Always the same story. They didn't appreciate me. The manager had it out for me. They're cutting costs. His voice on the phone that day had been small, hoarse with embarrassment. "Mom," he'd said, "I've messed up. I can't keep borrowing your car. They're threatening to repossess mine." He hadn't asked outright. Michael never did. He let silence hang long enough for guilt to do the asking for him. I remember standing at the dealership counter with a pen in my hand, the salesman smiling too wide. The contract slid toward me, my name printed neatly beside purchaser. Michael stood beside me, shoulders hunched, eyes red. When I handed over the cashier's check, he whispered, "You're saving me." I'd smiled back, hiding the tremor in my chest. That's what mothers do. We took the photo afterward, his laughter loud in the sun. I remember thinking he looked like the little boy who used to climb into my lap after nightmares, asking if monsters ever apologized. I told him they always did. I didn't realize he'd grow up believing that. Now, years later, the photo felt heavier than paper should. I turned it over and saw the date written in my handwriting, June 12th, 2019. I'd even drawn a tiny heart beside it. The edges had curled with time. His smile, once boyish, now looked practiced charming in the way people learn to be when the truth stops working. I studied his eyes, searching for the man I'd believed I was saving. But all I could see was my own reflection. Ghosted in the glossy surface, a woman who kept mistaking rescue for love. The Camry itself still sat in his driveway on Sycamore Street. Every time I'd driven past, I'd felt a flicker of pride. Now I felt something colder, smaller, a realization that I had built the foundation of his carelessness with my own open hands. I set the photo down beside my coffee cup. The light caught the silver car just right, like it was gleaming again under the dealership sun. Only this time, I saw the truth behind the shine, the way I'd traded pieces of my security for one more chance to fix what couldn't be fixed. I slid the photo back into its folder and closed it carefully. The sound of the drawer clicking shut was small, but final. Outside, the gulls were crying above the harbor. The sound rose and fell, sharp and distant, like something being released. The next morning broke clean and pale, a soft light bleeding through the kitchen blinds. The house still smelled faintly of rain from the night before. I brewed my coffee, strong and black, letting it sit on the counter until it turned bitter. I didn't add sugar this time. Sweetness felt dishonest. The papers I'd pulled from the drawer lay stacked neatly on the table: mortgage statements, transfer slips, car titles, proof of every quiet rescue I'd ever made. The edges were worn from years of handling, but they told the story clearly enough. My name was everywhere, printed over and over, like an echo of all the times I'd stepped in to keep Michael's world from falling apart. I sat down and stared at the documents for a long while. There had always been an invisible thread between us, a thread spun from worry and habit. I'd spent decades tugging it back every time he strayed too far, believing that if I just held on tightly enough, I could keep him safe. But threads can turn into ropes, and ropes can choke. Outside, the street was quiet, except for the sound of a delivery truck rumbling past. Somewhere down the block, a wind chime clinked lazily in the breeze. The ordinary world kept moving, unaware that mine had shifted overnight. I reached for the leather folder that had been sitting on the bookshelf since my retirement. It was the one I used when I closed my last client's account, an object that had once meant order, closure, precision. I ran my hand across the grain of the leather, then began sliding the papers inside one by one. Each sheet landed with a soft whisper, the sound of something ending. I paused over the photo of the Camry. His smile still caught the light, but it no longer softened me. I slipped it between the final pages and pressed the folder shut. When I worked as an accountant, I used to tell my clients that every number told a story, and every story had a limit. Once you cross it, I'd say you're no longer managing debt, you're feeding it. Maybe motherhood wasn't so different. You pour in what you have, thinking you're buying love when really you're just financing your own disappearance. I sipped the cold coffee, its bitterness steady on my tongue, and felt something inside me settle. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sorrow. It was stillness, the kind that comes when you finally stop fighting the current. I sealed the folder, tied it shut with the thin strap, and placed it beside my purse on the counter. The decision didn't need ceremony or witnesses. It simply existed, clear as sunlight on paper. I would not fund my own disrespect any longer. Through the kitchen window, I could see the azaleas beginning to bloom pink against the damp soil, the first color of the season. I stood there a moment, breathing in the scent of coffee and salt air, before reaching for my keys. The folder waited beside them like a quiet promise. By the time I walked out the door, I already knew where I was going. The drive to Sycamore Street took 20 minutes, though it felt longer with the weight of the leather folder on the passenger seat. The morning air had that clean, briny scent that only Charleston carried after a night of rain. My hands stayed steady on the wheel, the kind of steadiness that comes when there's nothing left to lose. Michael's neighborhood was one of those new developments pretending to be old rows of pastel houses with wraparound porches and shutters painted in heritage colors. Every lawn was clipped within an inch of its life. Theirs was the blue one, with the white columns, the house I'd made possible, with a single signature. Brittany's SUV was parked crooked in the driveway, its bumper glittering with decals. Live, laugh, love, family. First, blessed. I parked on the street, turned off the engine, and listened to it tick as it cooled. Then I picked up the folder, stepped out, and walked toward the porch. Michael opened the door before I could knock. He looked rumpled, half awake, barefoot, in a t-shirt. "Mom, what are you doing here?" I didn't answer. I held out my hand. "The keys," I said. He frowned, confused. Keys to the house and the car. For a second, he laughed a short, nervous sound. You're kidding, right? Is this about Sunday, Mom? Come on. I'm not kidding. I opened the folder, pulled out the title documents, and laid them across the top step. They're both in my name, always have been. The color drained from his face, replaced by something sharper. Anger trying to disguise fear. You can't just show up like this. This is my home. It's the house I bought, I said quietly. You've been living here on my payments for 5 years. The door creaked open behind him. Brittany appeared, hair-perfect phone in hand. What's going on? Your mother's having one of her episodes, Michael muttered, turning to her. Then you'd better film it, I said, so you can show everyone exactly what an episode looks like. Her smile faltered. The neighbors had started to notice. Across the street, Mrs. Daniels from number 12 was pretending to water her begonias. 2 houses down, a man paused mid-mow, resting an elbow on his lawn mower handle. Brittany's voice sharpened. You're embarrassing us. I'm reclaiming what's mine, I said. That's not embarrassment. That's accounting. Michael stepped closer. Mom, stop this. We can talk about it inside. I'm done talking inside houses I pay for, I said. I reached into my purse, pulled out a spare key ring, the originals I'd kept from the purchase signing, and held them up. You can mail yours to me once you've packed. He blinked like I'd struck him. You're serious. I've never been clearer in my life. For a moment, the only sound was the wind rustling through the magnolia leaves. Then Brittany's composure cracked. Fine, she snapped, shoving the car keys into my hand. Take your precious car. I'll buy another one. She turned, heels clicking against the porch, and disappeared into the house, the door slamming behind her. Michael stayed where he was, jaw tight. You think this makes you look strong? It doesn't. It just proves you're bitter. I picked up the documents, slid them back into the folder, and met his eyes. No, Michael. It proves I'm finally done. His mouth opened, but no words came. I could see the exact moment he realized I wasn't bluffing, the way his shoulders dropped, the childish indignation dissolving into panic. I turned and walked down the steps, the gravel crunching beneath my shoes. A neighbor waved awkwardly as I passed. I nodded back, calm, unashamed. When I reached the car, I opened the driver's door, laid the keys on the passenger seat beside the folder, and took one long breath. The breeze carried the faint scent of gardenias from a nearby yard, sweet but heavy, like endings always are. I started the engine. In the rearview mirror, I saw Michael still standing on the porch, one hand gripping the rail, the other hanging useless at his side. He didn't follow me. He didn't call my name. By the time I turned the corner, the house was already shrinking in the distance, blue bright, and finally, no longer mine to carry. The next morning, Charleston woke under a sky the color of pewter. Clouds hung low over the harbor, pressing the air into a heavy stillness. I left early, the leather folder resting on the passenger seat beside me, the car keys clinking softly every time I turned a corner. The bank sat on East Bay Street, its brick facade as polished as the people who worked inside. I had walked through those glass doors dozens of times over the years, usually to withdraw money, sign a transfer, or quietly fix a mistake Michael had made. This time, I came for silence. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of printer ink and fresh coffee. The line was short. When it was my turn, I stepped up to the counter and found a familiar face behind the glass. Mrs. Hartwell, the teller, said brightly, "It's been a while. How's your son doing? Still working on that property over on Sycamore?" Her name tag read Laura. Though she'd been in this same spot so long, we'd stopped needing names. I remembered her once telling me how wonderful it was that a mother would help her child get a start in life. She'd smiled back then as she handed me the mortgage forms, saying, "You must be so proud." Now her smile faded when she saw the folder in my hands. "What can I help you with today? I'd like to cancel an automatic payment," I said. My voice was steady, almost gentle. "All right," she replied cautiously. "Which account?" "The mortgage on 214 Sycamore Street." Her fingers froze over the keyboard for half a beat before continuing. "Oh, of course." One moment. The soft clicking of keys filled the air, a small, efficient rhythm. She glanced at the screen, then back at me. "You've been making those payments for quite a while, haven't you?" 5 years, I said. "Every month on time?" Laura hesitated, her brow creasing slightly. "May I ask, Mrs. Hartwell, is there an issue?" "We can always adjust the terms or set a temporary hold." "No." I placed the signed revocation of authorization across the counter, its notary stamp still damp from yesterday morning. "I'm ending my involvement completely. Effective today." The document slid toward her like a final line drawn in ink. She studied me for a moment before nodding. Understood. Her tone softened. "Once I process this, your name will be removed from all future payments. There's no reversing it." "That's the idea," I said. Laura clicked a few more keys, then turned the monitor slightly toward me. A red button glowed on the screen beside the word "Autopay Status." "Please confirm," she said quietly. I nodded once. She pressed it. The sound was barely more than a click, but it landed in my chest like thunder. On the screen, the word changed. Canceled. Laura printed a confirmation page, slid it across the counter, and stamped it with thick red ink. I watched the paper curl slightly under the pressure. "There you go," she said softly. "You're all set." I folded the page and placed it back into the folder. "Thank you, Laura." She hesitated again, lowering her voice. "You know, people don't usually cancel help for family." "Are you sure you're doing the right thing?" "I am," I said. "Sometimes love looks like letting go." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The faint hum of the air conditioner filled the space between us. Then she smiled, small, respectful, and gave a single nod. When I stepped outside, the clouds had begun to break. The street smelled of rain and something clean, almost metallic. I walked to my car, the confirmation paper rustling inside my folder like a heartbeat. As I started the engine, the digital clock flipped to 10:01. It was still morning, but it already felt like a new life had begun, quiet, deliberate, and entirely my own. The first call came before noon. I was folding laundry by the kitchen window, watching sunlight spill across the counter, when my phone began to vibrate. The name Michael flashed on the screen. For a long moment, I just watched it buzz. Then I picked up. "What the hell did you do?" His voice was sharp, ragged with disbelief. "I just got a notice from the bank saying the payment failed." "What's going on?" I took a breath, folding one of my towels in half, pressing the edges until they met. "I stopped paying," I said evenly. There was silence. Then a low, bitter laugh. "You can't just do that. This isn't your money game. You're ruining my credit, Mom. You're 35, Michael. You can manage your own payments. I have bills, a mortgage, a family." "So did I said. "And I learned to pay for mine." He went quiet for a second, then hissed, "Unbelievable. Brittany was right. You always have to be the victim. You can't stand it when someone else moves on." The line crackled. I could hear him breathing hard, pacing, maybe the sound of a door slamming in the background. "Do you even realize how this makes us look? I'm sure you'll find the words to explain it," I said. My voice calm, almost detached. "They're in the paperwork." He cursed under his breath and hung up. By the time I poured myself another cup of coffee, the phone rang again. Tom. My ex-husband hadn't called me directly in years. His voice came through deep and steady, but with that familiar edge of control that once used to guide every argument. Evelyn, I just spoke with Michael. What are you doing? He's frantic. I'm doing what I should have done a long time ago. He sighed, the sound long and heavy like an old sermon. You're upset. I get that. But cutting him off financially? That's cruel. He's your son. He's our son, I corrected. And he's an adult. You had 20 years to teach him how to stand on his own. You didn't. Tom's tone hardened. You always loved drama. You couldn't just talk to him, you had to make it a spectacle. Brittany says you showed up yelling. I didn't yell, I said quietly. I asked for what's mine. You should try it sometime. He fell silent. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. You think you're proving something, but all you're doing is burning bridges. He'll never forgive you. Then at least we'll finally be honest about where we stand. Before he could answer, I ended the call. For a moment, the kitchen was perfectly still again. The clock ticked, the dryer hummed softly, and outside, a mockingbird sang like the world hadn't changed at all. Then the messages started. Brittany's number lit up the screen first. Each text came in a flurry. You're destroying your own family. You need help. You'll regret this when no one visits you again. You're sick, Evelyn. The last one had a picture attached, a photo of her and Michael smiling beside the Camry I'd paid for. The caption read, Some people give love. Others just take it back. I stared at the image until my vision blurred, not from tears, but from something colder, clearer. I pressed delete and set the phone face down on the counter. The silence after was absolute. The phone buzzed again, but I didn't reach for it. I poured my coffee into the sink, rinsed the cup, and wiped the counter clean. Outside, a breeze swept through the garden, carrying the faint scent of magnolia and sea air. It struck me then that for most of my life, I had answered every call, every demand, every plea. I had filled silence with explanations, apologies, and fixes no one deserved. Now, I let the phone keep ringing. By late afternoon, the battery had nearly died. The calls had slowed to a few angry voicemails, each one shorter than the last. I didn't listen to any of them. Instead, I opened the window, letting the warm air drift in. Somewhere down the street, children were laughing, their voices high and bright against the hum of summer. I leaned against the counter, the folder still lying open beside me, its red stamped papers catching the light. For the first time in years, I felt something close to quiet pride, a strange, steady peace that came not from what I'd done, but from everything I'd finally stopped doing. By Thursday morning, the calls had slowed to a trickle. The quiet didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt earned. I had slept for nearly 8 uninterrupted hours, the best rest I could remember in years. At 9 sharp, I parked outside the brick office of Klein & Associates, a small legal firm tucked between an insurance agency and a florist on Meeting Street. I'd chosen it on purpose. Not one of those gleaming glass towers where men in navy suits talked louder than reason, but a place that looked like it respected time and detail. Inside the lobby was calm and faintly scented with coffee and lilies. A young receptionist looked up from her computer. "Good morning. You must be Mrs. Hartwell." "Yes," I said, holding up my folder. "I have an appointment with Ms. Klein." "Of course. She's expecting you." The waiting room was quiet walls lined with framed photographs of Charleston landmarks, the Battery, the old courthouse, the bridge at Sunrise. A sense of steadiness lived here, the kind that doesn't need to prove anything. After a few minutes, the door opened and a woman in a slate gray suit stepped out. She was in her 40s, tall with dark-rimmed glasses and the kind of posture that didn't need to announce authority. "Mrs. Hartwell, I'm Laura Klein." Her handshake was firm, not rushed. She gestured toward her office. "Come in. You brought documentation?" I assume I nodded and handed her the leather folder. She took it with both hands, as if she already understood the weight it carried. Her office was simple books, neatly shelved, a single fern in the corner, a brass lamp glowing on the desk. She motioned for me to sit while she opened the folder. The first few minutes passed in silence, punctuated only by the soft shuffle of papers. She moved methodically, scanning bank transfers, deeds, notarized receipts, even my old accountant ledgers. Every so often, she'd make a quiet hum of acknowledgement. When she finally looked up, her eyes were steady. "You've documented everything. Every transaction, every payment, every instance of support. You're covered." I exhaled, realizing I'd been holding my breath. "So legally." "Legally, you have every right to withdraw financial assistance," she said. "Your name's on the deed, the mortgage, the car title, the utilities. He's been living on your credit, not his. If he wants to dispute ownership, he won't get far." I nodded slowly, the validation landing deeper than I expected. I thought maybe I'd done too much, or not enough. Laura folded her hands on the desk. "You did what parents do. You helped. But now you're doing what adults must, setting boundaries. The law doesn't punish that." Her tone wasn't soft, but it wasn't cold either. It carried the rare mix of logic and compassion that professionals often forget how to use. She continued, "What you've done already, the bank cancellations, retrieving the assets, those were smart first steps. But you need to protect yourself fully. File a written notice of financial separation. That will prevent any future liability if your son defaults on payments or if his wife tries to involve you." I hesitated. "She's already tried. Brittany's been sending messages, threats mostly about embarrassment." Laura's mouth tightened just slightly. "Then document them. Keep everything. People lash out when their safety nets are cut. Let them. Just make sure you keep the receipts." The words made me smile faintly. "I'm good at keeping those." Her eyes softened. "I can tell." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. She flipped through the last few pages, then closed the folder gently. "You've spent a long time cleaning up other people's chaos, haven't you?" "Yes," I said quietly. "Since the day I signed my first marriage certificate." Laura leaned back, her gaze direct but kind. "Then this is the first time you're doing something for yourself. Don't apologize for that." Something in me loosened, a small, quiet release, like a knot finally untangling. She began drafting the necessary documents while I sat there watching her pen glide across the paper in quick, confident strokes. The sound reminded me of something ancient and precise, order being restored one signature at a time. When she finished, she slid the papers toward me. "Sign here and here. Once this is filed, you're legally disentangled. He'll receive formal notice within 30 days. I signed both lines. My hand steady, my name flowing across the page like an ending and a beginning all at once. Laura gathered the papers, stacked them neatly, and met my eyes again. "You're doing the right thing, Evelyn. It's not revenge, it's reclamation." As I stood to leave, she offered a faint, almost conspiratorial smile. "Don't worry. We'll handle the noise. You just hold your ground." Outside, the sun had broken through the clouds, scattering gold across the wet pavement. I walked slowly back to my car, the leather folder lighter in my hands, now that it held something new, proof that I wasn't crazy, that my story finally had a witness. For the first time in years, I felt seen, and that more than any victory felt like freedom. Laura's office smelled faintly of coffee and cedar polish, the scent of long mornings and clean decisions. The blinds were half drawn, cutting the sunlight into narrow stripes across her desk. I sat opposite her, my hands resting on the leather folder, as she arranged the final pages for signature. "This is the notice," she said, sliding the top sheet toward me. "Notice to vacate. 30 days. The words looked simple enough, almost polite, like something you could pin to a bulletin board. Yet everything beneath them, years of giving, covering, rescuing, was finally distilled into one act of withdrawal. I read it once more, then nodded. "Go ahead." Laura reached for her notary stamp, the metal catching the light. The thud of it hitting the paper sounded sharper than I expected, final and oddly satisfying. When she lifted it, the red seal spread slightly at the edges, a small bloom of ink that looked almost alive. "There," she said. "It's official." I exhaled through my nose, a quiet release I hadn't realized I'd been holding. For weeks, every movement had felt deliberate, heavy, with consequence. But now, in this small act of pressing ink to paper, something shifted. The power I'd given away piece by piece had found its way home. Laura signed her own name below mine. "Once this is filed, the clock starts," she said. "They'll receive the notice by certified mail within 48 hours. There's nothing ambiguous about it." I nodded. Ambiguity was what had kept me trapped for decades, hoping that if I just explained myself better, someone would understand. This wasn't explanation. It was clarity. As she organized the paperwork, she said, "Do you want to deliver a copy in person, or shall we handle it through the courier?" "In person," I said before. I could think. "I want to see it leave my hands." She studied me for a second, then gave a small, approving nod. "Then, take this copy. It's yours." I reached for it. The paper was warm from the stamp and slightly rough along the edges. My name appeared beside the legal address, Evelyn Marie Hartwell, owner and financial grantor. For years, those words had meant obligation. Today, they felt like evidence of survival. Laura slipped the remaining copies into a manila envelope. "Once the 30 days are over, you'll be free to reclaim full possession. If they resist, I'll file the follow-up order." "I don't think they'll fight," I said softly. "Not once they see it in writing. You'd be surprised how people react when reality is printed on paper." I gave her a faint smile. "I've lived most of my life managing other people's realities. This time, I'll just let the paper speak." When everything was signed, stamped, and sealed, Laura stood and shook my hand. "Take care, Evelyn. You've earned the right to stop apologizing." Her words lingered as I gathered my folder and walked toward the door. The hallway outside seemed brighter, filled with the faint hum of a copier, the shuffle of distant footsteps, ordinary sounds that for once didn't demand anything from me. At the end of the corridor, I paused to glance at the document one last time. The red seal glowed under the fluorescent light, a small emblem of something irreversible. I folded the paper carefully, slid it back into the folder, and closed it with a quiet snap. This time I whispered, "I'm not sorry." Then I stepped into the sunlight, the folder tucked under my arm, and felt the warmth of the day meet the cool steadiness of my resolve. By the time I turned onto Sycamore Street, the sun was already high and sharp, bleaching the roofs and sidewalks into a single glare. The moving trucks were there, 2 of them backed into the driveway like blunt instruments of truth. Men in gray uniforms carried boxes down the porch steps, their movements brisk and impersonal. I parked half a block away, lowering my window just enough to let in the breeze. The air smelled faintly of cut grass and dust, the scent of endings. From where I sat, I could see almost everything. The front lawn was littered with fragments of a life I'd paid for: a beige couch, sun-faded along the edges, a lamp I'd once picked out for a housewarming gift, the dining set Brittany had bragged about refinishing with her own hands. It all looked smaller now, shrunken by daylight and consequence. Neighbors had begun to gather in quiet pairs. Mrs. Daniels stood at her fence, her dog at her feet, pretending to tug at weeds that didn't exist. Across the street, a teenage boy balanced his bike on the curb, phone tilted just enough to capture what was happening. The red notice of termination was taped to the front door. Its edges flapped against the frame, catching the wind like a flag that had already declared surrender. Michael appeared in the doorway, his hair uncombed, face flushed and tired. He barked something at the movers, too fast, too loud, but they kept working, unbothered. His gestures grew sharper, more desperate, until one of the men simply handed him a clipboard, pointed, and turned away. The authority in that simple motion was final. He pulled out his phone, pacing across the lawn. I watched him lift it to his ear, wait, then lower it again. He tried a second time, a third. Whoever he was calling Brittany probably wasn't answering. His hand trembled as he shoved the phone back into his pocket. From where I sat, I could still see the silver Camry parked near the curb, sunlight bouncing off its hood. It looked out of place among the boxes and sagging furniture, clean and functional, a reminder of promises I'd once believed in. I remembered the day I gave him the keys, the way he'd hugged me with such force that it had left bruises on my ribs. I'd mistaken that squeeze for gratitude. Now I understood it had been panic. One of the movers set down a box too hard, and something inside shattered. Michael flinched at the sound but didn't move. He just stood there, shoulders bowed, like a man realizing the storm had already passed and taken everything with it. I rested my hand on the steering wheel, my nails pressing into the leather. I wasn't angry anymore. The satisfaction people expect in moments like this, the cinematic revenge, the smug victory, never came. What I felt was quieter, heavier, like watching a door close that should have closed years ago. The house itself looked strange without curtains. The windows reflected the sky in pale streaks, the rooms behind them empty and hollow. The life they'd built inside arguments, laughter dinners I'd paid for, was spilling onto the lawn, piece by piece. At one point, Michael stopped pacing and sat down on the front step. His head fell into his hands. A neighbor approached cautiously, murmuring something I couldn't hear. He shook his head, eyes fixed on the ground. The breeze shifted through the open window, carrying faint sounds, the scrape of boxes, the hum of the truck's engine, the low murmur of gossip weaving through the street. All of it merged into a dull rhythm that felt almost like forgiveness. When the last of the furniture was loaded, the movers handed Michael a receipt and climbed into the truck. He didn't look up as they drove off, leaving the curb bare except for the couch and a few stray cushions. I stayed a little longer, watching the sunlight move across the porch until it touched the red notice. The paper fluttered once more, then went still. Michael finally rose and glanced around the street. His eyes swept past my car, not recognizing it, or maybe pretending not to. For a brief moment, I saw the boy he used to be, the one who'd once run across a parking lot, waving his report card, shouting, "Look, Mom, I did it." Now he stood in the same place, but with nothing left to hold. I rolled up my window and started the engine. The sound startled a bird from the magnolia tree nearby. It soared into the bright sky, cutting through the heavy air with effortless grace. As I drove away, the house shrank in the rearview mirror, blue still, and finally silent. A week after the eviction, Charleston began to whisper. Not loudly, never loudly, but in that southern way, where politeness softens cruelty and everyone claims to have heard just enough to be concerned. It started with Brittany's boutique. Luna and Linen, the shop she'd opened 2 years earlier on King Street, was closed one morning without warning. The glass door bore a handwritten sign in pink marker, temporarily closed for inventory. But everyone in Charleston knew what temporarily meant when the racks inside stood empty. By the end of the week, the whispers had grown sharper. Customers who'd bought gift cards were posting online, asking where their refunds were. The landlord, an older man named Franklin Lowe, who'd always liked to talk, let it slip that rent hadn't been paid for 3 months. Then came the IRS letters. Thick, official envelopes, their corners stamped in red. They arrived at the Sycamore Street house before Michael could forward his mail. One of the movers must have given them his new address because soon enough, the letters began showing up there too. By the time the second week ended, Luna and Linen's social media accounts had vanished, and so had Brittany. No one knew where she'd gone. Some said Florida. Others said her sister's place in Nashville. I didn't need to know. The truth travels just fine without a destination. At the grocery store, I overheard 2 women by the produce aisle. "You hear about that boutique owner?" The one with the white Camry, one asked. The other sighed, picking through avocados. Shame. All that talk about empowering women, and she couldn't even pay her taxes. They moved on to gossip about a new restaurant downtown. I stood there for a moment, hands resting on the cart handle, realizing how ordinary collapse could sound when it didn't belong to you. Tom called a few days later, his voice tighter than usual. "I just came from the club," he said. "Everyone's talking. They're saying you had something to do with it." "With what?" "With the audit, the letters, the boutique going under. You didn't, did you?" "No," I said. "I didn't need to." He sighed heavily. "You've made a mess, Evelyn. For all of us." I let the silence stretch until he hung up. The next day, I drove past the golf club out of habit. Through the gate, I could see the cluster of men in pale shirts and pressed khakis laughing in the shade near the carts. Tom stood slightly apart from them, pretending to check his phone. He looked older than I remembered, the smooth confidence that once filled every room now curving inward. Even from a distance, I could tell he felt the chill of being quietly discussed. Karma, I thought, doesn't knock. It just rearranges the seating chart. By evening, the phone had stopped ringing altogether. I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, the harbor breeze carrying the faintest trace of salt. Across the street, Mrs. Keegan waved as she watered her hydrangeas, pretending not to notice the folded copy of the Post and Courier in my lap, the one with the headline about Charleston Boutique. Faces IRS inquiry. I didn't clip the article. I didn't even read it twice. Justice didn't need applause. It worked on its own schedule in quiet cycles that didn't demand explanation. Sometimes it showed up as a notice in the mail, sometimes as a missing friend, sometimes as the hush that follows when people finally run out of excuses. As the sun dipped low, the air grew cooler, brushing across my skin like something clean. I thought about Michael, wherever he was staying now. I wondered if he'd started to understand that love without respect is just dependency dressed up in softer words. The wind shifted, rustling through the magnolia tree by the fence. I sipped my tea and let the sound fill the silence. There was nothing left to fix, nothing left to say. The story was telling itself now, and I had no reason to add a word. The phone rang just after midnight. I had been reading half asleep, the lamplight washing the pages, in a soft gold haze. The sound startled me. It wasn't the polite buzz of a text or a scam call. but the sharp, urgent vibration of something that still knew how to find me. For a moment, I let it ring. Old habits told me to answer, to fix, to soothe. But something in the stillness of the house reminded me that silence could be a boundary, not a punishment. On the fourth ring, I reached for the phone. Mom. His voice cracked before the word even finished. I didn't speak. Please, he whispered. Please don't hang up. The background was quiet. No Britney, no television, no noise. Just a faint hum, maybe from a motel air conditioner, or the night traffic beyond wherever he was staying. Mom, I don't know what to do. I don't have anywhere to go. I kept my tone level. You have 30 days. I know, He stopped, then tried again. The words, tumbling. I can't sleep. I can't eat. You've never done this before. You've never turned your back on me. I leaned against the headboard, listening to the sound of his breath trembling through the line. There was a time when that sound could undo me. Now it only hurt in a quieter, cleaner way. I didn't turn my back, I said softly. You turned yours years ago. He was crying openly now. That night, I didn't mean what I said at dinner. I was angry. She was pushing me. You meant every word, Michael, I interrupted, still calm. You just finally said them out loud. The silence stretched heavy and unsteady. I could almost hear him shaking his head, the disbelief of a man who'd never been told no for long enough to think love was the same thing as permission. Mom, he said again, smaller this time. I don't have money for the next payment. I can't get another loan, not with the IRS mess. Please, if you could just help me through this month, I'll fix it. I swear. I closed my eyes. There it was, the loop I had lived inside for decades now, spoken like a prayer with no God left to answer it. I've already helped you through 100 months, I said, and it never fixed anything. You don't understand, he snapped, suddenly, voice breaking through the tears. I'm your son. You're supposed to care. I let the anger hit wash over and fall away. I do care, I said. That's why I stopped. For a long time he said nothing. Just the sound of him breathing uneven, hollow, like someone learning what emptiness really feels like. Please, he whispered again, quieter now. Don't do this to me. I'm not doing anything to you, I said. I'm just not doing it for you anymore. Another silence. I could hear the shift in his breathing, the realization settling in, not the dramatic kind, not the cinematic collapse, but something slower, heavier. The sound of a man meeting the weight of his own life for the first time. I don't know how to start over, he said finally, voice almost childlike. You will, I told him, the way I always had to. I could hear him trying not to cry again, the quiet sniffle of someone whose tears no longer solve anything. I'm sorry, he said after a while. I wanted to believe it. Maybe I did in some small way. But sorry was a word that came too late, the kind that patched holes in memory, not in behavior. I know, I said gently. He exhaled long and shaky. Good night, Mom. Good night, Michael. When the line went dead, I set the phone face down on the nightstand. The room was still, the lamp humming faintly, the sea wind rattling softly at the window pane. Outside, the harbor lights flickered across the water, distant and constant, steady in a way people rarely are. I turned off the lamp and lay back in the dark, listening to the silence. It didn't feel empty anymore. It felt earned. The news reached me the way gossip always does in Charleston, wrapped in courtesy, softened by a whisper. I was shelving returned books at the library when Margaret, one of the volunteers, leaned close and lowered her voice. You've heard about Brittany, haven't you? I shook my head. No, she's being audited. IRS, they say. Her accounts are frozen. Poor thing. Margaret paused, studying my face. Imagine all that work for nothing. I nodded, gently. Yes, I said. Imagine. When she drifted off toward the front desk, I stood still for a long time, fingers resting on the spine of a worn novel. The morning light filtered through the tall windows, dust motes floating in its path. Somewhere down the hall, a child laughed a small, bright sound, untouched by consequence. Later that afternoon, as I walked home past the harbor, my phone buzzed with another message. It was from Helen, an old neighbor. Saw the boutique's name in the paper. You must feel vindicated. I stared at the text before deleting it. The word vindicated didn't sit right. It sounded like something that belonged in other people's stories, the kind where revenge feels clean and endings are meant to satisfy. But this wasn't that kind of story. This was quieter, heavier, like a tide finally pulling back to reveal what had always been buried underneath. By evening, the sky had turned a bruised lavender. I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, the newspaper folded beside me. I hadn't read the article yet. I didn't need to. The world was already taking care of the narrative. Justice, I thought, never needed an audience. It had its own rhythm, slow, patient, meticulous. When Tom called later, his voice was clipped. You've seen the paper I have. She's humiliated, he said. It's destroying her. I stirred my tea once quietly. Some lessons I said arrived stamped, not spoken. He didn't respond. The line went silent, and for once I didn't fill it. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of salt and jasmine. Somewhere in the distance, a bell from the docks chimed once soft and low. I folded the newspaper, placed it on the table, and watched the light fade until only the water remained a vast, unbothered mirror. The restaurant was small, tucked between two brick buildings on East Bay, the kind of place that smelled of rosemary and warm bread. Anna had chosen it for her daughter's 8th birthday. Something simple, she'd said, just family. Candles flickered down the center of the table, their light catching the silverware in soft, trembling glints. Laughter moved easily among the children, their joy unburdened and pure. I sat at the end of the table, content to watch a quiet witness. Halfway through the meal, the door opened. A brief hush passed over the table before the noise of conversation returned in careful fragments. Michael stood in the doorway. He looked smaller, somehow, thinner, worn at the edges. The easy arrogance that used to live in his posture had vanished. He was holding a small, unwrapped box with a ribbon tied awkwardly around it. When his eyes met mine, there was no anger, only hesitation. Mom, he said, his voice lower than I remembered. Can I join you? Anna nodded before I did. She'd already made room for him at the far end between her husband and the empty chair where he used to sit years ago before everything cracked open. The waiter brought another plate. No one said much while he served himself, the clatter of silverware loud against the hush of unspoken things. When the cake came out, strawberry, her favorite, the children sang voices, high and uneven, and for a moment it almost felt like the world had remembered how to breathe. After the candles were blown out and the laughter softened, Michael cleared his throat. Mom, he said again this time, louder eyes on the table. I need to say something. Everyone went still. Even the children seemed to understand this wasn't a moment for giggles. He took a shaky breath. I was wrong. About everything. About what I said that night, about how I treated you. I thought being helped meant being owed. I'm sorry. His words hung there fragile but honest. I didn't rush to fill the silence. I let them settle. Let them live in the air the way truth does when it finally arrives, uninvited but overdue. Then I nodded, once. Respect, I said. Quietly begins when the shouting stops. Michael's eyes lifted, and for the first time in years they looked clear. Not grateful, not pleading, just open. He gave a small nod, the kind that carries more weight than tears ever could. Anna exhaled softly, relief flickering in her smile. The children returned to their chatter, unaware they'd just witnessed something fragile being mended, if not fully repaired. When dessert plates were cleared and goodbyes began, Michael lingered near the door. "Thank you for letting me come," he said. "You're welcome," I replied. It was all that needed to be said. Outside, Charleston's evening air was cool and full of distant music from the waterfront. As I walked to my car, I looked back once through the window, the table glowing with candlelight, the empty chair still there waiting for the next beginning. The morning light over the harbor was thin and gold gliding through the blinds like quiet approval. On the kitchen table lay a neat stack of papers, bank statements, insurance updates, a freshly printed draft of my new will. The leather folder that had once held old receipts now carried the shape of a different future. For the first time in decades, every number in front of me was mine. No hidden loans, no quiet withdrawals, no emergency transfers written out of guilt, just a clean ledger. I spent the morning with a financial advisor, a woman named Dana Ortiz, mid-40s, sharp-minded but kind in her tone. She listened as I explained how I wanted everything handled from now on. Simple accounts, automatic savings, and a portion set aside for a women's financial literacy program I'd recently read about. "You want to fund education?" Dana asked, glancing up from her tablet. "Yes," I said, "specifically for women starting over after divorce or debt. I wish someone had shown me how not to confuse love with obligation." She smiled softly. "That's a legacy that pays forward." By noon, the paperwork was signed. My old accounts, joint messy emotional, were closed. A new system replaced them, structured around one principle I'd never practiced until now: boundaries. On the drive home, I felt lighter. Not joyful exactly, but steady. Like the floor beneath me had finally stopped moving. Anna came over that afternoon to help organize some of my files. She brought a basket of scones and that easy laugh of hers that always seemed to fill a room without effort. We sat on the porch, sorting documents while gulls drifted overhead. "You're really rewriting your will?" she asked, eyebrows raised, as she flipped through a folder labeled Estate Planning. "I am." "Does Michael know?" I looked out at the water, the sunlight catching on the ripples. "Not yet. But he'll be fine. I'm leaving him something smaller but real, something he has to handle himself." Anna smiled, half amused, half proud. "You know, people might call that selfish." I sipped my tea, letting the steam brush my face. "If they call it selfish, I said it's probably healthy." She laughed. "That sounds like something you should embroider on a pillow." "Maybe I will," I said, "or I'll donate the fabric instead." We worked quietly for a while. After that, the sound of pages turning and distant waves folding against the shore. At one point, Anna reached over and squeezed my hand. "You did it, Mom," she said softly. "You actually turned the ship around." "Not quite," I replied. "I just learned to steer." When she left, the house settled into its familiar calm. I walked to the desk by the window, where the evening light poured across the wooden surface, warm and forgiving. There I opened my checkbook and wrote the first donation to the fund, just a modest sum to start. The pen moved easily, the ink smooth and deliberate. In the margin of the receipt, I wrote a note to myself. Freedom isn't leaving. It's staying without losing yourself. Outside, the wind had shifted, carrying the scent of the sea through the open window. I closed the ledger, slid it into the drawer, and felt the rare peace of completion, the kind that doesn't depend on anyone's apology or approval. When the first stars appeared above the harbor, I whispered a small blessing under my breath. Not for Michael, not even for Brittany, but for the woman I used to be. The one who kept paying and hoping instead of pausing and choosing. This time the quiet didn't feel like emptiness. It felt like ownership. A year had passed since the morning I sealed the last envelope, since the sound of my own signature had marked the quiet turning of a life. Charleston woke gently that day, sunlight trembling over the water like spilled gold. I sat on the porch overlooking the harbor, a cup of Earl Grey warming my hands. The gulls cried faintly above the masts, and the tide lapped against the wooden posts below with a rhythm I'd come to know by heart. On the table beside me rested a single photograph, Michael at 10 years old, barefoot, in the backyard, his hair sticking up in a dozen directions, a turtle cupped carefully in his palms. The corners of the photo had begun to fade, but his smile hadn't. I looked at it now without ache, only memory. He called sometimes. Not often, not easily, but the conversations had grown civil, steady exchanges about work, about Anna's kids, about the weather. There were still spaces between us, but they no longer felt like wounds. More like fences, necessary, peaceful marking, where one garden ended and another began. The wind picked up slightly, teasing the edges of the newspaper folded on the chair beside me. The headline read something about a new marina project downtown. Life, it seemed, kept building itself whether anyone watched or not. I poured another cup of tea, the steam curling upward in thin ribbons that caught the light. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed 10 times each note, dissolving into the quiet morning air. I took a slow sip, the warmth settling deep in my chest. Around me, the harbor shimmered boats, gliding smooth and certain across the calm. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for anything to change. I was simply there, steady, grounded, whole. And when the breeze shifted again, carrying the scent of salt and jasmine, I smiled, not from victory, not from forgiveness, but from release.